The cops called him a piece of trash from the streets and planted drugs on him. 6 hours later, they were the ones in handcuffs. He didn't scream. He just waited. Look what happened when the truth came to the police station. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're from. The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon laid over the still body of the Louisiana night. Out here, where trees lined the road like silent witnesses and the air smelled faintly of damp pine, there were no gas stations lit with neon, no diners serving burnt coffee, no other vehicles except the occasional set of high beams passing in the opposite direction. Just the road, the dark, and the low hum of rubber meeting asphalt. Isaac Rowell drove with both hands on the wheel, the dim blue glow of the dashboard reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving. He wasn't doing anything wrong. The black Lincoln moved smoothly, its engine a quiet murmur beneath the classical music playing at low volume. In the passenger seat lay a leather folder worn, used but intact. Inside were papers, memos, affidavits, handwritten notes, digital printouts, and a flash drive tucked into a side sleeve. Some of the documents were signed by people who preferred not to be named. Others bore photocopies of police reports that had never made it to courtrooms. That folder, sealed with a simple elastic band, was heavier than it looked. It contained enough to rattle the foundations of several small police departments if opened in the right office. Isaac wasn't returning from a meeting in any official capacity. There had been no advance calls, no staff, no security detail. Just him and the Lincoln. The meeting had taken place in a Baptist church basement outside Shreveport, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, over stale donuts and styrofoam cups of coffee. Community leaders had spoken in hushed voices, not entirely trusting even the floor beneath them. They had been burned before, their complaints ignored, their words buried under bureaucracy. But when Isaac listened, they had believed him, not because he promised results, but because he didn't promise anything at all. Just truth. He had nearly 2 hours left before reaching Baton Rouge, where he planned to check into a hotel under a different name and review everything again. He had planned to stay quiet, anonymous, unnoticed. But then came the lights. Blue and red suddenly flooded the rearview mirror, cutting through the dark like a siren scream frozen in color. Isaac didn't flinch. He took a breath, lifted his foot off the gas, and guided the Lincoln gently to the shoulder of the road. The gravel crackled under the tires as he rolled to a stop. He set the gear in park, turned down the music, and kept both hands on the steering wheel. Always both hands, always visible, always. Behind him, the patrol car's engine stayed running. One officer stepped out from the driver's side, the other from the passenger seat. Their silhouettes moved with the familiar swagger of men who believed they owned the road, the night, the air itself. One of them shined a flashlight directly into the rear window of the Lincoln. The beam danced along the leather seats before stopping on Isaac's headrest. He rolled down his window. The air outside was thick with humidity and the scent of wet grass. The officer with the flashlight approached, boots crunching gravel. The other circled around the car, peering inside, hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. Isaac stayed silent. He had nothing to explain. The first officer leaned down, shined the light directly into Isaac's eyes, and asked for license and registration. Isaac complied slowly, carefully, movements measured like a man disarming a bomb. He handed over his identification, which the officer barely glanced at before walking back to the patrol car. The second officer tapped the trunk with his knuckle, then opened the back door without asking. He began to rummage through the back seat. There was no probable cause, no suspicion, no conversation, only assumption, only authority exercised without restraint. A minute later, the first officer returned. His expression had shifted slightly. There was a smirk now, faint but growing. He gestured for Isaac to step out of the vehicle. Isaac did. The moment his shoes touched the gravel, he felt the shift in the atmosphere. Something had changed. The second officer, still near the rear of the car, now held something in his hand, a small plastic bag with white powder. Isaac stared at it without blinking. He didn't need to say anything. He already knew what they were doing. They didn't search him. They didn't ask further questions. One officer barked an order and grabbed Isaac's wrist. The other pushed him forward. They slammed him onto the hood of his car with a force that felt personal. Metal met bone. His ribs screamed. His cheek pressed against the hot engine cover, and he could feel the residual heat rising into his skin. The cuffs clicked shut with mechanical certainty, metal biting into flesh. No Miranda rights, no explanations. The smirking officer held up the bag of powder as though displaying a trophy. The other laughed, a hollow practice sound. They began dragging Isaac toward their cruiser. Then one of them turned back. He walked toward the Lincoln and pulled something from the trunk, a red plastic gas can. Isaac, still restrained, was pushed to the ground and forced to watch as the gasoline poured over the hood of his car, trickling down like tears over the grill. The match was struck. The fire ignited with a low whoosh, followed by a rising crackle as flames consumed paint and metal and leather. The heat came quickly, smoke followed. The air filled with the scent of burning rubber and oil. Isaac didn't scream. He didn't shout. He watched, his face pressed to the asphalt, as the last physical piece of his father's legacy, the car he had inherited, cared for, kept clean, was turned into a pyre. A tire exploded behind him with a sharp pop. Shards of rubber bounced across the road like stones skipped across water. A car slowed in the distance, then another. A few people watched. At least one filmed. None interfered. The officers pulled Isaac to his feet. Blood had soaked through the sleeve of his shirt from a tear in the fabric. Dirt clung to his cheek. The cuffs dug deeper. They shoved him into the back of the patrol car. He didn't resist. He sat upright, silent, eyes forward, his breathing even. The ride to the precinct was long and slow. The officers said little, though one of them chuckled now and then. The rearview mirror tilted occasionally. Isaac could see one pair of eyes watching him, growing uncertain. His silence unnerved them. They were used to fear, to pleading, to angry outbursts, but not this. At the station, they opened the door and pulled him out. His legs were stiff from the awkward seating position, but he didn't falter. They walked him through the front like a criminal exhibit, exchanging crude jokes with a few other officers. One of them tossed the baggie onto a desk with theatrical flair. Another commented on Isaac's clothes. Too nice, too clean, too much for someone like him. Isaac listened. Every word settled in his memory like a note in a ledger. His belongings were emptied into a tray. His phone buzzed on the desk, screen glowing with an incoming call. The name on the screen read, Governor L. Hutchins. One of the officers paused, frowned, and flipped the phone face down. Isaac said nothing. They took his fingerprints, photographed his face, and led him to a holding cell with cold walls and flickering lights. The door shut behind him with a metallic clunk. He sat in the far corner, hands resting on his knees. He didn't pace. He didn't lean. He watched the wall in front of him as if waiting for it to speak. Outside, the laughter of officers continued. Inside, Isaac counted every tick of the second hand on the clock above the booking desk. He didn't need to move. He didn't need to speak. Because the moment they'd struck the match and thought they had erased him, they had already lost. And dawn was only a few hours away. The echo of the cell door still hung in the stale air as Isaac Roll leaned back against the cold concrete wall. The cot beneath him was nothing more than a steel frame with a thin plastic-covered mattress. And even that small mercy felt misplaced in a space meant to punish more than hold. The blood on his shoulder had dried stiff against the fabric of his shirt, and every movement reminded him of how carelessly he had been thrown, dragged, and battered. But he didn't flinch. Pain was not new to him, and this pain had purpose. Every bruise was a mark of exposure, evidence of who they were when no one was watching, and soon everyone would be watching. He had not spoken a word since being thrown into the cell. No questions, no protests, no declarations. That silence, so foreign in this place of noise and chaos, had begun to fester in the minds of the officers beyond the bars. They expected pleading, demands, maybe even curses. Instead, they got stillness. And in that stillness, Isaac had already taken control of the room without lifting a hand. From his corner, he could hear everything. The jokes, the laughter, the idle stories of traffic stops gone sideways. There was no fear in their voices, only arrogance, only the certainty of men who had done this too many times to count and had never once been held accountable. He listened to their names as they called out to one another, to the rhythm of their boots as they passed his cell, to the way they spoke of him as if he weren't within earshot. He was the drug guy, the city clown, the one who ran his mouth. None of it mattered. Not their words, not their assumptions. Only time mattered now. And time, he knew, was already working for him. Outside, the early hours of morning crept closer. The precinct was a tired building, walls faded from years of scuffed boots and careless elbows, the linoleum floor permanently dulled by grime and footsteps. The air carried the faint bitterness of stale coffee, long extinguished cigarettes, and the chemical sharpness of industrial cleaner. It was the kind of place that absorbed the tone of its inhabitants, where the rot of misconduct didn't hide it settled in. At the main desk, Officer T.J. Harlan sat with his boots propped up, flipping through paperwork with one hand while sipping lukewarm coffee with the other. He glanced occasionally at the monitor that displayed the live feed from the holding cells. Isaac sat in the same position he had been in for the last hour, upright, quiet, his gaze fixed somewhere past the wall. "You see this guy?" Harlan muttered to Officer Cody Slade, who had just entered the room with a donut half-eaten in his hand. "Hasn't said a damn word since we brought him in. Just sits there like he owns the place." Slade chuckled through his bite. Probably thinks if he stares hard enough, the walls will fall down. Creepy type. Maybe he's got something wrong upstairs. Harlan grunted and turned his attention back to the tray of belongings on his desk. The suspect's wallet, a key fob, and a phone still vibrating from missed calls. The screen lit up once again, and Harlan squinted. Governor L. Hutchins. The name flashed again and again. A call, then a text, then another call. He didn't answer. He simply picked up the phone and dropped it face down again, ignoring the way it made his fingers itch. He didn't want to admit the growing knot in his stomach, probably just a bluff. People always had someone to call when they were desperate. Didn't mean anything. He shifted the phone further back on the desk and looked again at the bag of powder. Sealed. Marked. Logged as found under the driver's seat. The story had already been written. The report drafted before the cuffs had even clicked shut. Slade was already bragging to the rookie in the break room about how easy it had been. "Guy practically arrested himself," he said with a grin. "Didn't even try to run, just handed it to us." But behind the bravado was something else, a flicker of confusion. Slade had watched enough suspects cry, curse, or at least push back. But this one had done none of those things. He had simply waited. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. In the cell, Isaac leaned his head back against the wall, letting the cold settle against the bruises beneath his hair. The flickering fluorescent light above him buzzed faintly, like a dying fly. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, he wouldn't sleep, but to think, to remember every detail, every word, every name. He knew already how this would unfold, knew the steps before they were taken, but he would let them walk those steps anyway. He could feel the shift beginning, subtle, like the air pressure changing before a storm. The confidence in the officers' voices began to thin as the minutes ticked by. Harlan walked past his cell twice in 1 hour, glancing in each time. Slade had stopped making jokes. They hadn't even opened his file yet, hadn't checked his credentials, hadn't looked in the sealed folder now sitting inches from Harlan's elbow. They were so sure of what they thought they saw, they didn't even ask who he was. Isaac kept counting. 127 minutes since they brought him in. 54 minutes since the first missed call from the governor's office. 28 since the second. He felt the moment approaching, like the deep tremble before an earthquake. Outside, the sky began to pale. The trees beyond the high windows took on the shape of silhouettes. A shift change was nearing. A new set of officers would soon arrive, fresher and less certain of the lie that had been built during the night. A few officers were already yawning, stretching, checking their phones. Back at the desk, Harlan rubbed his eyes and shifted uncomfortably. The phone buzzed again. A third call. This time he looked at it for longer. Not because he meant to answer, but because he felt like someone was watching. The name burned into the screen. Isaac opened his eyes. He sat up straighter. It was almost time. He stood, moving slowly to the center of the cell, where the camera would catch him in full view. His posture was perfect. Shoulders squared, back straight, hands loose at his sides. He stood there, unmoving, like a statue carved from patience. He looked not at the wall this time, but at the lens of the camera above the door. Harlan noticed it. He glanced up at the monitor and scowled. Slade re-entered the room and stopped cold at the sight. "He's just standing there," he muttered. "So?" Harlan asked, but his voice lacked the earlier sharpness. "Feels like he knows something," Slade replied, and for the first time, there was no humor in it. They stood there watching the feed, and Isaac stood, watching them from within it. The quiet stretched. Beyond the walls, the world was waking up, and in a few minutes, the knock on the front door of the station wouldn't be from a lost traveler or a delivery driver. No, Isaac thought, closing his eyes once more, as the first gold rays of morning touched the tops of the precinct's tired walls. It would be them, and nothing would ever be the same again. At exactly 8:07 a.m., as if summoned by the rhythm of the clock Isaac had silently kept in his mind, the heavy front doors of the precinct swung open with a force that made every head in the room turn. The early morning haze that lingered outside briefly spilled into the lobby, casting pale gold light across the scuffed linoleum and chipped walls. The temperature of the air inside the building shifted as four men stepped through the threshold, dressed in tailored dark suits, their movements deliberate and precise. They didn't ask for directions. They didn't hesitate. Their presence alone was enough to silence conversations, still laughter, and freeze half-finished gestures mid-air. The lead figure was tall, silver-haired, with a hard-cut face and a voice like old gravel. His eyes scanned the room once briefly, with the kind of judgment that didn't need words. Behind him, three others followed closely, each carrying thick leather portfolios embossed with gold seals. They didn't flash badges, they didn't need to. Everything about them screamed federal final, unquestionable, uninvited. At the front desk, Officer Harlan had been sipping his third cup of bitter coffee, the foam from powdered creamer still clinging to the rim. The sight of the newcomers caused him to stiffen and set his cup down without a word. He tried to recover his usual posture, leaning back, arms crossed, a flicker of annoyance rising behind his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, keeping his tone level, feigning control. The silver-haired man didn't even glance at him. Instead, he spoke directly to the desk sergeant behind the counter. "We're here on authority of the United States Department of Justice. Where is Isaac Rowell?" The words landed like a gavel, hard and clear. The sergeant blinked, glanced at Harlan, then at the monitors above the desk showing the holding cells. There was no confusion in the question, only the demand of someone who already knew the answer. Harlan opened his mouth, instinctively ready to deflect, but nothing came out at first. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He cleared his throat. "Rowell? You mean the suspect? He's in holding, picked up on felony drug charges. Guy had narcotics in his car. We've got the evidence." The man turned then, slowly, as if only now acknowledging Harlan's existence. His face did not register surprise or anger, only disdain, the kind earned by men who had seen this scene before, too many times to count. He took one step forward, his shoes echoing on the tile. "No," he said, "he's not a suspect. He's a federal civil rights investigator assigned to this district, and you've just committed false imprisonment, destruction of property, unlawful use of force, and obstruction of justice against a protected federal officer." The room stopped breathing. From down the hall, Slade emerged from the break room, half-eaten muffin in one hand. He froze in place, eyes flicking from the suits to Harlan, to the monitor showing Isaac still standing in the center of his cell, calm and immovable. "You're kidding," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. He's DOJ." The silver-haired man didn't reply. Another agent stepped forward, a woman with sharp features and a sleek bob haircut. She carried a folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. She spoke evenly, eyes locked on the stunned officers. "We have video evidence of the traffic stop, the fabrication of narcotics, the destruction of the subject's vehicle, and the use of physical force without provocation. We also have civilian recordings from two separate witnesses and audio from the in-car unit you failed to disable properly. Everything has been logged and verified." The words crashed into Harlan and Slade like waves. They didn't move. They couldn't. Slade still held the muffin, crumbs falling unnoticed to the floor. "Where is his property?" the woman asked. Harlan gestured dumbly toward the desk, where the phone still sat face down, now vibrating silently with what would be the fifth missed call. She picked it up, looked at the screen, and nodded. "Governor Hutchins confirmed he placed those calls personally," she said. "You ignored them. That alone carries weight." In the silence that followed, a soft click echoed through the room as the lock on Isaac's cell released. From the far hallway, footsteps approached, slow, steady, measured. Isaac appeared at the end of the corridor, his posture as unbending as it had been all night, the bloodstain on his sleeve still visible, though dry now and darker than before. His eyes scanned the room once and stopped on Harlan. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He only looked. One of the federal agents stepped forward and helped him into a dark blazer, buttoning it neatly over his torn shirt. The simple gesture seemed to invert the world inside the station. Isaac no longer looked like a prisoner. He looked like what he had always been, the man in charge. He walked forward until he stood in front of Harlan. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but it carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was irrefutable. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Harlan tried to answer. His mouth moved, but there was nothing left to say. Behind him, Slade dropped the muffin. It hit the floor with a dull splatter. The female agent raised her hand and gestured. Two other officers from a separate agency stepped forward and approached Harlan and Slade. There were no more jokes now, no clever lines, no puffed-up chests, just the sound of handcuffs being drawn and snapped into place. The irony of it all hit the room like a delayed thunderclap. The same men who had forced Isaac to the ground, shoved him into a cruiser, and mocked his silence, now stood immobilized, their wrists locked behind them, heads lowered. The silence that followed was total, deafening, absolute. As they were led past him, Isaac said only one thing, low enough for no one else to hear, but sharp enough to slice through every barrier they had ever hidden behind. "You thought I was nobody. Now the whole country knows your names." The doors of the precinct opened again, this time to the flash of cameras, the swirl of press badges, and the shouted questions of journalists who had gathered within minutes of the tip-off. Outside, news vans lined the curb, microphones angled toward the entrance, and the two disgraced officers were marched out in full view of the world. Inside, Isaac stood still for a moment longer. He didn't need to follow them. His work wasn't finished. It was only just beginning. He turned to the woman with the bob haircut, and with a slight nod signaled the next phase. The building would be swept, files uncovered, lockers open, dash cams reviewed. Everything they had buried in years past would now be exhumed, exposed, and examined under federal scrutiny. He left the lobby in silence, stepping into the hallway with the certainty of a man who no longer had to explain himself to anyone. The institution that had mocked his presence was now forced to reckon with his authority. And this was only the first precinct. The morning sun had fully broken through the trees now, lighting the walls in brilliant streaks of gold. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, not in pursuit, but in retreat. The revelation was complete, and the reckoning had begun. The footage hit the airwaves before noon. It began with the burning vehicle on the side of the highway, flames licking the sky as smoke curled in slow spirals against the pine trees. Then came the voiceovers. Two officers, their faces blurred only briefly, laughing, posturing, claiming the discovery of drugs in a traffic stop that, according to them, had turned violent. Their voices, recorded from dash cams and smartphones alike, were played across every screen, every news site, every major network. But what followed stripped away any ambiguity. The slow-motion shots of Isaac Rowell, face pressed to the pavement, his wrists bound tight, blood smeared across his sleeve, told the story more clearly than any statement could. Then, almost theatrically, the scene shifted to the next morning. There they were, Harlan and Slade led from their own precinct in cuffs, escorted by federal agents, their heads lowered, eyes shadowed behind sunglasses that could not hide shame. The images went viral before the sun even reached its peak. Within hours, statements poured in. Civil rights organizations called for sweeping reforms. Politicians scrambled to make their voices heard. The governor's office released a formal declaration of support, not only for Isaac Rowell, but for the investigation he had now officially launched. And in the towns scattered across the southern corridor of Louisiana, Where whispers of police abuse had long been met with silence or dismissal, people began to speak. Isaac didn't appear on camera. He made no press statement, gave no interview. His face was seen only once emerging from the precinct in that bloodied shirt and clean blazer, composed and unreadable. That image alone was enough to become a symbol. In protest signs and social media posts, in newspaper editorials and courtroom petitions, that still frame him walking upright while others were being escorted in chains became a rallying point. He didn't seek fame. He didn't want it. What he wanted was momentum, and now he had it. Inside the Department of Justice, Isaac resumed work without pause. Within 48 hours, he had signed off on formal subpoenas for records in 4 neighboring parishes. Anonymous complaints, long buried in locked drawers or misfiled in archives, were now being pulled into the light. Evidence lockers were opened. Body camera footage, long thought to be lost, was restored and reviewed. Patterns emerged like mold in a damp room: systemic abuse, procedural violations, falsified reports, doctored testimony. The names changed, but the tactics remained the same. In one precinct, Isaac discovered 23 cases over 5 years where suspects had been charged based on mysterious, anonymous tips that were never traced. In another, dash cam recordings had been erased days after complaints were filed. In yet another, a teenage boy had been arrested 3 times within a month for resisting arrest, though no original offense had ever been documented. The sheer volume of it was staggering. But Isaac didn't flinch. He reviewed everything. He took meetings in silence, listening, taking notes, asking questions that struck like needles into the soft underbelly of local systems. And the moment any official tried to deflect, to minimize, to push blame down the chain, he simply stared until their sentence withered. The quiet he had held in that cell became his armor in boardrooms and briefings. People listened to a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. The trial for Harlan and Slade was scheduled before the end of the month. Their attorneys tried to delay, citing media bias, public hysteria, anything to slow the process. But the judge appointed from out of state for neutrality refused. The evidence was overwhelming, the video unassailable. Their fate was not only sealed but televised. They were stripped of their badges, their pensions revoked, their reputations dissolved in a matter of days. Their faces, once seen with smug grins on patrol, were now etched into the public record as the face of everything the justice system claimed it wasn't. Their names were no longer feared. They were pitied, despised, or forgotten. But for Isaac, the work continued. Weeks later, under a sky brushed with soft clouds, Isaac stood once again on that long stretch of highway. The road shimmered faintly under the sun, and though traffic occasionally passed in the distance, the area where his car had burned remained quiet. The scorch marks had faded, but not vanished. A darker stain remained along the asphalt's edge, like a ghost left behind in tar and oil. He stood alone. No entourage, no press. Just him, the breeze and the memory. From the back of the SUV parked behind him, he retrieved a small stake and a metal plaque. He carried it with both hands to the edge of the road and pushed it into the dirt, pressing until it stood firm. The plaque was simple, unadorned, brushed steel engraved with only a single line. Here they tried to erase truth, and here it endured. He stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. Not for himself, but for all the ones who hadn't made it this far. For the names in those buried files, the voices ignored, the lives undone by silence. He stood for them now, and the ground beneath his feet knew it. He bent down and placed a single sunflower beside the plaque. It wasn't chosen randomly. His mother had once told him that sunflowers were stubborn things. They grew where others wouldn't. They faced the light, even when it burned, and they always came back. Then, with nothing more to add, he returned to the SUV. Inside, folders lay neatly stacked on the seat, new cases, new precincts, new patterns to expose. The driver waited silently. Isaac nodded once, and the vehicle pulled away, tires crunching softly over the gravel shoulder as they merged back onto the road. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because this town would never forget. They would remember the night they laughed while his car burned, and the morning they stood in his place, the weight of justice finally real and unrelenting. And beyond this town, others were watching, other precincts, other officers who once believed they could act without consequence. Now they weren't so sure. Now they checked their cameras. Now they watched their words. Now they asked, before assuming, because the quiet man they once dragged to the ground had not only risen, he had turned the system inward, showing it its own reflection. And the silence they once mocked had become the sound of reckoning. If this story moved you, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Watch our other videos for more powerful stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.